Hello everyone, I'm Lindley Gooden. A very warm welcome to episode 2 of Future of Utilities, the online series. We're broadcasting live today and next Thursday, working through ideas and practical strategies for the utilities industry as we adapt to the current crisis and beyond. Now, our next 2 live episodes are jam-packed with leaders forums, interactive panels, online networking opportunities. And today we're focusing on 3 key areas: streamlining operations, reducing operational cost, and improving incident response. Now, you're here, so you've made it onto GRIP. Congratulations. This is our AI-driven online event platform where content and networking happen side by side. There are lots of features available to maximize your time. You can book meetings now, you can add sessions to your personal schedule, and of course, have your say during our live Q&As. You're very much part of our time together. I'll be asking you to do that regularly through the morning and the early afternoon. Now, let's have a quick look at around GRIP so that you can make the most of it. Firstly, do explore the event agenda, first of all. You can also curate your own personal schedule by clicking on the Add to Session button or the calendar icon. You can find your personal schedule under the My Schedule section on the left-hand bar. This will also include your scheduled meetings. So do regularly have a look at that. On networking, it's open right now, every Thursday and Friday over the course of the episodes, and here's how it works. If you see a person or a company that you'd like to connect with, easy. Click on the Interested button or click directly on the button labeled Meet. Now, once you're connected, start a chat or have your meeting. Now, GRIP also does some of the legwork for you. If you head to the Recommended for You section, you can see people who match the profiles that you're looking for. Or you can see who's swiped right on you in the Interested in You section. Very exciting, also in the left-hand bar. Now, if you have any questions throughout the day, head to the Future of Utilities hub and send a message using the Message Future of Utilities button. And of course, a big thank you to our sponsors, many of them who just made these events possible. Visit their hubs from the homepage where you can find prize draws, exclusive content, and of course, team members who you can connect with directly and talk to. We are 100% live today, so you can send in your questions throughout the event using the box on the right of us, and I'll put them to our panelists when the time is right. Okay, lots to cover, so let's get started. First up this morning, we're looking at ways to overhaul network management to maintain resilience and successfully navigate the rapidly changing demands of the pandemic. Now, coronavirus is obviously putting operations of many utilities companies under heavy pressure. The way we're using energy, gas and water has changed overnight under lockdown, affecting operational processes and making it an even bigger challenge to keep the lights on and the taps running. So our first session is all about how to redesign operational strategies to respond to the disruption with agility. Let's start by meeting our fantastic panelists. First of all, Jonathan Booth. Hello, Jonathan.
Good morning.
Great to have you with us. Good to see you there. Jonathan is the head of asset management at Electricity Northwest. Great to have you here. James Harrison is second. James, hello.
Good morning. Good morning.
Great to have you here too. James is the director of Cadent Gas's London network. So we've got lots to cover, and we'll throw the floor open to you at the end of our first discussion. So you can send your questions in throughout the session using the live Q&A field, which again is on your right. So get in touch there. We really want to hear from you. Okay, so let's get into it. We're focusing on network management to maintain resilience through the pandemic. Jonathan, first of all, has the crisis highlighted any new barriers to change, do you think?
Well, Lindley, I think it's highlighted some new barriers, but also I think one of my observations is it perhaps has just trimmed a little from the top of some of the old barriers.
Right.
So I think I'll just explain a little bit what I mean by that. I think in terms of the new barriers, one of the things that we've found that we've had to do is take into account sort of customer attitudes and approaches very carefully.
Yeah.
I think particularly in the early days of the crisis, there's a huge amount of change in customer approaches and attitudes to us and our services. At a time when things like electricity and gas supply become ever more critical, people were hunkering down in their homes, people were not wanting to be disrupted, quite rightly. So I think customer behaviour did change very, very quickly early on in the crisis, and I think it'll be interesting to see how customer behaviour comes out of this and how we might have to adapt to it. But I think on the flip side, and perhaps something we'll come back to, is in the face of a crisis, we've actually been able to adapt much more quickly than perhaps one would have imagined.
Yeah.
And some of the previous barriers to change that would take a long time to get sort of innovation embedded in a business, perhaps we've been able to accelerate.
That's a very important point, isn't it, James? So many plans have come to fruition earlier because they just had to. I mean, there's so much had to be done immediately. But in terms of change, well, this whole process has been a big change.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a huge amount of change, and it's certainly accelerated some things and almost created some organic growth and organic decision making right at the front line where we meet our customers. I agree with Jonathan about the kind of barriers. There haven't been that many. Customer perception and customer sentiment is the one that Jonathan called out. I guess the thing that we found quite challenging is this kind of the social side of things, the social change. People's expectations are different now, even to the extent where we've got two engineers working very closely together, who've worked together for years, but they might have a different approach to life. Yeah. They might be going home to an ill partner or be a carer, and their kind of their appetite to what they're able to do has changed quite significantly during this time. Yeah. So to react to that, we've had to kind of crew up different people and reschedule some elements of our workforce so that they can continue to deliver a great service.
Yeah, I suppose if you watch the news, in which we all have during this time, you'll know that we've all had to prioritize. We had to shift our priorities and really focus on what's important. Jonathan, I suppose in terms of barriers to change, there is one barrier in that we've had to deal with what's important to us personally as a workforce, as well as what the company needs to do. So that is a barrier to change, because actually we've got enough to deal with.
Absolutely, and I think that has been a barrier because, as James says, people have been dealing with very different personal circumstances through this crisis. And I think one of the things that has done, though, and this perhaps is across the workforce as a whole, is it has, because everybody has been subject to the same pandemic. That's a great leveler of things. And I think even as we're doing now, even for those who are working from home, if you see people in their home contexts, perhaps there has been just a little more empathy amongst colleagues in the organization, because everybody is trying to deal with their own personal circumstances, and maybe that has led to an improved culture of understanding of difference, as James says. I mean, sometimes that produces new conflict, but I think I have observed that colleagues are perhaps that more empathetic to each other, and perhaps that helps you just collaborate a bit better. It's when everybody's at home on Zoom or Skype or so on, it's a very democratic way of trying to share ideas, and perhaps some of those old structures that you used to have to deal with are perhaps just crumbled slightly.
It sounds a bit like a cultural overhaul. It sounds like that's not necessarily throughout the business, throughout every person that works with you, but actually, that's fundamental. That's a really big building block. If there's an empathy, if there's a small amount more sharing of ideas, well, that actually is a benefit coming out of adversity, isn't it, really, Jonathan?
And I think collaboration is a good word, Linley. I think, and that's where some of we're fortunate in that some of the IT and some of the systems that we have now, 5 years ago, if we were trying to manage in this circumstance, it would have been a whole lot more difficult, because we do have some of these more, these collaborative tools that we can start to use. Yeah. And I think that one of the things I have sort of observed is that works quite well if you are relatively long established in a business, and you have a thick contacts book effectively. So if you are sort of stuck and you need to contact, who to talk to and so on. I think one of the things we've become sensitized to is making sure that perhaps people more junior in the organization or have shorter service in the organization, who perhaps could feel a little lost because they don't have the office environment and colleagues on hand to talk to. I think one of the things that we've learned is that we need to make sure that we look out for those colleagues as well, and make sure that they're sort of included in the collaboration.
Absolutely. We'll move on to the nitty gritty in a second, James, but just on this point for a moment, you've also seen your guys out in the field, perhaps, craving social contact, to try to stay in touch with what used to be part of the job.
Yeah. I mean, in our previous previous 9 months ago, 6 months ago, we, for example, our engineers would meet once a month in an office. They'd have a team brief, they'd have a cup of tea, they'd have a bacon sandwich, and they catch up, not just catch up on work, they catch up on what's going on in their private lives.
Yeah.
And there's a real sort of community around that. In the current environment, we obviously can't do that. So they've kind of, when something has happened which has necessitated them being together, they've actually really enjoyed just the social side of catching up. And of course, I guess if you're a social animal in that way, that you like face-to-face contact, adapting to some of the media we use nowadays has been a bit of a change. I mean, our workforce has got a really broad breadth of technological kind of understanding, if you like.
Yeah.
Some are fine with iPhones and the video calls, others just can't stand them. So we had to work quite closely with people on that to help them understand how the technology can work and benefit them.
I mean, you know, I guess everyone watching us today has experienced their own version of this, but these are really important points because the culture is going to drive us forward. And let's look at that now. One of the biggest changes, of course, has been remote working. So, James, back to you. How is workforce scheduling dealing with that, and where do you think that will go? Because that'll be very useful to people watching us today.
So there's a couple of angles on this. First of all, there's scheduling to make sure that when we go to a customer's property, we're able to line up exactly why we need to be there, can clearly articulate what's going on, and then have the supply chain followed up behind us to make sure that the job is complete. I know, dig a hole in the road, everything needs to work even more smoothly than normal, because we've had to keep the main roads clear for ambulances and things to get around town. I guess from an IT point of view, we've started to see that people can actually work from home. They can do their scheduling jobs. They can dispatch emergency jobs from their front living room, if you like. So from a cultural point of view, we're seeing opportunities for people to actually work from home more and less of a need to go into a big office. One area that we are really kind of mindful of is our IT systems. If our IT systems fail, then we have to go into a business continuity system. If that fails, our business continuity is to use sheets of paper and the like to pass work around. So we've had to really accelerate up what electronic ways we can use to share work and share information if we fall into the worst case BCM scenario, which previously would have been a sheet of paper, you know. I guess the kind of the closing bit though on the workforce scheduling has been almost referring to what I talked about earlier on about the organic nature of the engineers coming up with their own ideas and ways to just get the job done. It's been really encouraging. They've reached beyond what they would normally do to make sure that the customer that they've just agreed with of how the work's going to be done is kept assured, kept promised with what we're doing.
That's great, because I was about to ask, you know, in the yin and yang way, Jonathan, you know, you might imagine, well, certainly before this all happened, you might imagine people would skive off. They'd use this opportunity to not be available, but actually on the other side, the ideas are coming through. There's something breaking free of this. You know, where do you think, in terms of the positive versus the negative, that this has brought us, Jonathan, from your point of view? You know, is it on balance bringing up an exciting new and productive way of working?
I think potentially yes, although I'll loop back to something that James said before. I mean, one of the things that we've had to do, and this is sort of looking at how we use technology to enable the workforce, is our mobile technology. And I guess like a lot of systems that utility companies will use, it was very much a sort of a push-based system. So things would be sort of centrally dispatched, and you would sort of pick up your work orders on your mobile device and execute them and debrief them back. What we've had to do, because as James says, you don't have people coming into central hubs, like offices or depots and then going out again, and because we've had sort of restrictions in terms of not wanting to go into people's customers' premises, not wanting to take planned power outages and so on, we've had to move the sort of the workloads and schedules around significantly. And one of the ways we've done that is to sort of move to more of a pool-based system where work banks are made available, and then sort of technicians and field staff can sort of pull it down and create their own schedules.
Right.
Now, what you come across there, I think, as James was suggesting, is that there are some people in the organization both embrace that empowerment and are tech savvy enough to engage with it. But there are other colleagues who perhaps are much more used to a more directive way of working, and also perhaps simply just don't have that sort of comfort with the technology to perhaps interact with it in a different way. So what we've found is that some people have found that a very empowering and flexible way of working, but it's also highlighted areas where we've had to put a lot more sort of training in, and almost an assurance, as you're saying, Lindley, that I mean, particularly for the home-based staff, that there are still sort of pockets of an assumption that if you're working from home, somehow that's not quite as productive as being in the office. And I think because everybody is subject to the same issue, it's been a great leveler in that regard, really, when everybody from the chief exec to the lower levels of staff are in the same circumstance. It's a fantastic chance to reset that sort of expectation, I think.
Yeah, it's an unfair expectation, actually, but of course it was well accepted, for many years, James, that if you're working from home, you're not being as productive. But actually, we've seen a lot of productivity increases in businesses, not just in utilities. So, but Jonathan raised a really, really good point. You need to take people who are not necessarily as comfortable with the technologies that are available as others. So you need to help those people to come forward with you. Is there a proportion of people who need to work as they were before in the sort of offices and out in the field the way they were? Is there a different proportion now, or are you starting to see the settling of who's working from home at the moment and who's working out and in the office?
We have so in a way fortunate, because we were given, I think Jonathan's team would have as well, given key worker status. So our frontline engineers still have to go out and fix gas leaks and sort out problems with the water network. And that for them, I think to begin with, they're thinking, it'd be nice to work from home. But 3 months in, it's been a real sort of almost a saviour to them. They've kept some normality. Their partner, the children, whatever have been at home. Kept some normality. So we've kept our operational, our customer-facing workforce has been carrying on doing just that. We had a spike when the virus first hit us of people having to self-isolate, but that reduced because we were able to get some testing done. Same actually with our office-based staff. Those that can work from home still work from home, but some have to come in for kind of operational reasons, to man a control center, for example, and they're still coming in. I guess longer term, or as we move into whatever the new normal is, there's going to be a far more understanding approach, I guess, to people working from home, and that myth of you're working from home, you're not productive, has certainly been dispelled.
So what about the opportunities for streamlining, but in many ways with resilience in mind, because that's why we're here. Where is the resilience? How do you embed the resilience? Things have changed so much, and they're starting to settle, but we all know there are changes ahead. So how can you embed resilience, start to integrate a resilient way of working into what you're doing across operational functions?
I guess from a resilient point of view, we need to be mindful of the kind of the mental health angle on some of this, and the emotion to what some people will have been going through. Almost helping them recognise that there is going to be no return to normality anytime soon. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge in terms of maintaining some continuity. In terms of scheduling, we have seen a change in gas demand. We've seen a change in our workload, so we've had to kind of reschedule engineers around that to meet customer demand. We've also noticed that as elements of lockdown have reduced, we've been able to do different types of work, and work that we could have put off for a month, say, are going to have to be done now. We're 2 or 3 months into this. So we've had to kind of forecast what work we're going to have to have done in 6 months before our busy period over winter. And again, that's necessitated us changing engineers' work patterns in some areas.
Jonathan, sorry, James, please, continue, please.
Yeah, the other piece I was going to say is we've we've had to work closely with other utility providers and other gas companies to provide that continuity as well. So I've collaborated with Southern Gas Networks who border us around how we can share resources if we have a local lockdown, or if there's a spike of cases in their patches or mine, so that we can just continue to help each other and continue to provide the continuity of supply to our customers.
Jonathan, same thing to you, really. That collaboration with other service providers. Also, we've talked about the skills in some ways. Getting people on board, making sure that everyone's happy to be working this way using digital technologies. How do you start to bring in that resilience, that ability to cope with the potential unexpecteds that are on the way?
Well, I think one thing we found on resilience is we haven't furloughed any staff, but some of the contractors that we worked with have furloughed staff. So one of the things that's required us to do is actually step in to do some of those activities that perhaps traditionally a contractor would do for us. And that's led to us perhaps broadening the skill base, and that is probably going to lead on to more discussions and questions about what skills do you sort of insource and have close to home, and then what do you sort of outsource, because that's a more efficient delivery model. And I think because we've covered a greater range of activities in terms of the field force, I think that's enabled people to have to be exposed to perhaps a broader range of activities than perhaps they traditionally would have been, which has created some opportunities for them to perhaps learn some of those new skills in new areas. I think there is a flip side to that, though, which is where, as James was saying, because activities have changed quite significantly, what we've become aware of is you need to be quite conscious of perishable skills. So if you're stopping doing an activity for an extended period of time, because you're wanting to minimize disruption or not going to people's houses or so on, but if that's quite a technical skill, you need to be quite careful that it's not perishing too quickly. So when you do start to go back and do it, I mean, the classic example is when pilots start flying again, isn't it? Will they remember how to fly the plane? Because that's actually quite a detailed skill. So what we're quite conscious of is there are potential safety risks when some of the activities perhaps step up again, and we need to make sure that we've maintained those skills that could have otherwise been lost in the meantime.
Yeah, James, it's a good point, isn't it? Sometimes it's almost like a muscle memory. It's assumed knowledge that perhaps you don't have after you've got rusty, to use that phrase. But the other thing is, I suppose when you're, it's really interesting that Jonathan has been, that they've been expanding their remit in many ways to fill in those gaps, which is essential. But actually, it's also a lot of pressure on the team and the skills that you have there. So I suppose you have to have a conversation really with the guys in the company, and that's got to happen soon, so that they feel that they are not being stretched too far, but also that I enjoyed that job. I'd like to do more of that. How can we, reposition a bit?
Yeah. Actually, I think it's probably more of the latter. Actually, they said, well, actually, why have we employed a certain contract to do this type of work when we can do it ourselves? But we need to go at the sort of same pace for everybody, and recognise that some people might not have the skills to pick that up immediately. There's definitely been a kind of expansion though in the type of tasks that people can do. And we've been driven to do that, so we minimise contact with our customers. I guess we need to just be able to take that and adapt it more whole scale across the company as we move forwards. And I guess the key worker element has been a real sort of I use the phrase shot in the arm for some of our workforce as well. They've got a real, I mean, they always had pride. They've got a real sense of pride now that they're able to kind of carry on working and deliver for our customers.
Yeah. I was about to ask you that just before you said the word pride. I mean, I know you will say, yes, I am proud, but what do you feel about the team? Have you been surprised by how, well they've dealt with this? James?
Yeah, I've been surprised by a couple of things. I guess we employ a few thousand people, and we have a reflection of society within our workforce. Yeah. And you get some people who are rightly quite concerned. They kind of vocalize some of that concern and say, well, do we really need to go and do this? What we've seen though is that within the depots locally, colleagues have come around each other and kind of articulated why we need to keep on providing the service that we do. So I've been, I'm proud of how the workforce has been. I've been surprised around the different sort of, I mentioned earlier, the different social angle that people have come across, and recognizing that their home life is very, very much the forefront of their minds. And I must admit, I hadn't really kind of considered that beforehand.
Why would you? It wasn't expected. This is a shock to the system, but it's been quite impressive, the reaction. Let's before audience questions in 10 minutes time, let's talk about digital and data. First of all, has this accelerated or pushed back timelines for digital transformation? Jonathan, first of all, what do you think about that? Is it, effectively a lot of organizations and sectors are reporting, look, this is our 10-year strategy is now happening right now. Is that what you've seen?
I think to an extent, yes, Lindley. I think in terms of the very sort of user-focused sort of digital aspects of digital strategy have come to the fore, definitely, because out of necessity. So things like the online collaboration tools, using the conferencing facilities, using sharing facilities like SharePoints and that kind of thing. I think that's quite sort of upfront, because that's been very necessary. I think in terms of some of perhaps the longer term digital transformation projects, I don't think I've particularly observed any massive sea change, to be honest. I think what we'll possibly see is a slight shuffling of the priority order. And I think in terms of, there will be more priority on perhaps more sophisticated mobile solutions that sort of cope with this perhaps more flexible workforce that we've sort of developed for ourselves. And I think that will feed back into sort of some of the work management sort of aspects that we talk about. I mean, early on in this conversation, James and I, we were still talking about things like scheduling and dispatch and those sort of those quite traditional functions which sort of revolved around a central hub. But I think the ability to work whether you're talking about the control room function or the field force, to work in a virtual sense, and how you enable that, I think they will probably be the priority topics.
James, what do you think about that? The interaction between the older systems and the ways that you have to work, the infrastructure, the physical infrastructure, and the use of digital, the use of data. I'm guessing that they've come through this period pretty well, but I guess it's looking to the future. Does it change your view on what needs to come first?
Yeah, it does. It does actually. I mean, at the moment we're just changing our data capture systems and our scheduling systems. It's certainly changed our line of thinking with that, to say, well, how much more can we automate things, and what really question some of the data that 6 months ago we thought we needed. The area that's been really helpful for me though is that in the last few months, the way the GATS networks operated has been very, very different to what it normally would. Now, we've pretty much had days where we see really low work on Christmas Day. We've kind of had about a month of that low level workload, and it's enabled us to look at our systems, our modeling systems, and question whether they really are kind of up to date, really are modern, and helping us redesign our physical network to a better technological network, as gas demand changes. But in the spirit of pushing through software and the like, my office team, we wouldn't have heard of Microsoft Teams. We wouldn't have known the functionality before this, and within a drop, we've had to start using it, dialing into it every morning, and kind of adapting to that technology. And in the back of my mind, that's made me think, actually, we're fairly adaptable people. And even if we have quite an extreme change to our systems, we'll be able to adapt to them.
All of us have been stuck in our grooves. We try to think, we think we're creative thinkers, but actually, until something like this happens, do you realize there was something right there? The access to this sort of these user-based portals and so on has been almost instant. Yeah, maybe just a couple of weeks of uncomfortable use, but then they come pretty naturally. In terms of asset data, Jonathan, back to you. How can we, and bearing in mind that it's not just COVID-19 that's hit us recently. Business has had to carry on. There are customers who won't yet have been affected by this in the way that others have been. So business has to carry on. what about the longer term view of asset data and how you continue to work better, with the data that you have at your fingertips, Jonathan?
Well, I think on any, we were reflecting on this earlier. Any emergency always catches you halfway through something. You're always sort of in the middle of some sort of change project when any emergency happens, and it causes you to sort of look at things afresh. And James's reference to sort of thinking about how what data you actually capture and what you use it for. And I think in terms of asset data, there are three things I think traditionally that have generally held us back. I think the systems themselves historically have been sort of standalone to perform particular functions. So most of us will have a control system. We will have an asset register, we'll have a GIS system, and so on. And then there'll be lots of effort to sort of hardwire bits of them to each other and make sure data flows. But they are pretty monolithic systems that sort of do a single purpose. And generally, and certainly this is our experience, is they are built around data that we collect ourselves. So certainly until relatively recently, one of my observations was, unless we'd actually collected the data, it wasn't actually data. So using sort of open source data about sort of demographic factors and so on is still relatively quite new to the sector. And the third thing is none of it's designed to be open. So it's all designed for quite a closed internal purpose. So I think we were already sort of working through the challenge of how do you come up with a much more sort of agile approach to your data management, so it's agnostic to specific systems. Yeah. How do you splice in sort of open source data so you get a much richer view of what your assets are doing and what their role is and what their risk is and their criticality and so on through some sort of analytics? And how do you actually start to open up some of that data? So perhaps other third parties and other actors can start to use it to perhaps create and present back to us new solutions for some of the problems that we had. So they were the three challenges that we were sort of already working through in moving to sort of like a new kind of architecture. I said, what will be very interesting to do with COVID, we've all talked about how rapid the uptake of sort of collaboration tools was, is how we might be able to accelerate some of the processes we were already going through to sort of meet some of those challenges.
It's certainly sped up things, hasn't it, James? Investigating not just your infrastructure, not just the way you work, all of the relationships in the business. I mean, all of this at once. You will have come up with conclusions that will change. What do you take away and what do you take forward from the experience of the company during COVID-19? What are the key things that really stick out as useful for the future?
A few things really. The first one comes to mind is the resilience and the good nature of our workforce, and how keen they've been to help maintain the gas supply. The other element is our necessity to liaise and engage with other utilities, and far more so than we had done before, to make sure that key roads are open and we're able to provide support the NHS and allow people to get to hospitals and things. But the most overriding thing, I guess, has been seeing how people have adapted to this technological change, and sort of there's the culture that sits behind it, but people have had to adapt to working at home. They've had to adapt to kind of being quite entrepreneurial in the way that they carry out their work and such like. And I've been really impressed with that. I guess it would be the kind of localized entrepreneurialism that I've been most taken aback by. And
finally, Jonathan, before we go on to questions from our audience today, on top of those, I'm sure you'd share those, but have you tested any assumptions, things that you thought were working perfectly, and then actually no, that didn't quite work the way it should have been?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the lessons is you can adapt when you have to. And I think organizations like ours are designed to respond to emergencies, but those emergencies usually last hours or days. I think effectively an emergency that's lasted months and has no clear ending is a completely different challenge. And I think what we're now probably in a stage where we've got ourselves to a bit of a new normal, to use that term, for some parts of the organization, but for other parts it's still sort of continued uncertainty. And I think that's one of our key challenges, is how we plan towards some sort of new stable process, because I think one of the things we've learned again is that in a crisis, you can accelerate your decision making and you unleash innovation. But at some point, you need to think about how you embed some of that to make it sustainable, because you can't operate in a crisis mode forever.
And that feeds into exactly what we were talking about at the start. You know, it's been adrenaline fueled, and now it's stamina, and so it's a very different situation that we find ourselves in, keeping that momentum going. But no, great, thank you very much. Great practical examples, stories. We all have our own, I suppose, but that's really good to hear. Now you've been writing in. Thank you very much to our live question Q&A box to our right. Please do that. You still have time, and do it throughout the day, obviously. But we have lots of questions coming through. Let's see how we can tackle these. We'll do what we can. Haley McLaren, thanks very much for writing in. Let's see how this goes. Do you see the strategic plans and investments that you had pre-COVID being reverted back, or will you have to shift to new plans with the lessons learned? And we're covering that a little bit, but I'll just throw it out there, even if we recap slightly. Jonathan, in brief, you know, I guess it's almost the proportion of pre-COVID plans that will carry on, or, you know, just shifting the way you're working.
I think in terms of the way we're working will change. I think in terms of the strategic plans, I'm not seeing a huge difference actually post-COVID. Right. I think one of the particular angles is that we'll have to think about very carefully. One of the things this has done is to emphasize just how important some of the services we provide actually are in terms of, you know, provision of gas, provision of electricity while people are at home. And I think that sort of, I think the valuation of those services has possibly increased after COVID, which means we probably have to sort of think more carefully about things like you know, power cuts, that we, you know, planning for power cuts, and in making sure that perhaps we improve the reliability to people who are kind of, you know, most sensitive to it.
Absolutely. We haven't even talked about vulnerable customers, but I'm sure we'll touch on that in a second. Now I've mentioned it. Chris Borland writes in, do you think you'll see an increase in the use of remote-based acquisition technologies for your asset inspection services in place of foot patrols? I'll throw it to James first of all. You know, do you see that the tech will start to take over where the foot patrols were? Will that change anything? I mean, you know, because people are still out on the road.
Yeah, I do. I think it's made us realise that, I mean, we have to go into some customers' properties because their gas pipes are leaking, and we need to kind of diagnose where that's come from. So we'll still need to do that type of work. But I think aerial surveys of our gas pipes, visual inspections of gas pipes going up the sides of a flat, for example, could be automated and reduce the need for our workforce to go into a different environment. So I would accept that is one area that we would need to accelerate. Yeah. I guess just thinking of the previous question about strategic plans has got me thinking, and I agree with Jonathan about some of our strategic asset plans maybe not changing so much at a whole system level, but we are seeing different ways that the gas network is operating. So we might see some investment in one part of town where we wouldn't have before. But the one strategic change that I've seen is that the size of our offices is we're now questioning whether we really need offices so big, and whether we really need that big kind of central office. So that would be the most strategic change, is our offices, what they're going to be like.
Very good point. The whole infrastructure thing outside the working infrastructure is a big old question that only you can answer, really, when the question comes up. Okay, Paula Roberts, thanks very much, Paula, for writing in. Do you see a need for more automation to drive efficiencies and ensure business continuity? Okay, so Jonathan, you mentioned you hadn't furloughed people, but I guess, you know, efficiencies still need to be focused on as much as they ever were.
Yes, they do, and I think what we've had to do is in order to keep our sort of workforce productive. I mean, one of the flip sides of the pandemic happening sort of at the time of year it has is actually we've had very low electricity demand and actually very few faults. So with not furloughing staff and keeping a workforce, the actual challenge of keeping them productive and busy has been quite a big one. And part of the response to that has been to be much more flexible and adaptable in terms of workloads and what we actually ask them to do. And that has involved two things, really. One is, as we mentioned before in our discussion about taking on some of the work that previously would have been contracted out. And secondly is sort of accelerating in work that perhaps was planned for some time in the future, where it can be done remote from customers' premises. It can be done out on a network, and it can be done safely. We'll do more of that kind of work and perhaps defer some of the more invasive work that perhaps involves more disruption to a later point in time. So I think a lot of that has been done. Initially, it was done in as you were saying, on adrenaline, quite ad hoc. And I think one of the challenges is how you then sort of embed that in the stamina phase and say, well, how can you capture that sort of flexibility, but actually in a sustainable way, such that you make sure you cover all the activities you still need to do.
Absolutely. I've got time for just one more question briefly. What steps are being taken to reduce call waiting times for customers impacted by furlough and or job losses? Let's just talk vulnerable customers. James, if you don't mind for a moment, I mean, this has been a focus for all companies, essentially, when they've got a good relationship with customers. What adjustments have had to be made? And, we are facing a time when financial difficulty may come in. Big issue. We can't cover it right now. But, how important will this be, do you think, going forward to help customers who need a bit of extra help?
Yeah, so I think we're in dialogue with the regulator actually around what kind of economic relief we can give to some of the gas suppliers, the likes of British Gas and Empower, to name a couple of the bigger ones. But what relief can their customers have in terms of paying the gas bill?
Yeah.
In terms of our workforce, we really need to make sure that we are even more aware than ever of customer vulnerability. And I think the customer vulnerability has changed quite a bit in the last, I know it's changed in the last few months, because we've just seen a completely different group of people become quite exposed to that vulnerability and the need for continuity of service. And we've had to adapt to that. But in a kind of customer bill payer point of view, absolutely. And we need to work as an industry, almost as a group of utilities, with our regulators about how we can support people economically.
The conversation will have to continue. There are other questions here, but we don't have time for them. But Jonathan, there was a question for you about, will you use contractors or will you keep doing things in-house? There is a section earlier on where we talked about that and the decisions that are being made on that because of the increase in the remit during this time. But there are other questions about suppliers of key data. But look, thanks very much for your questions. That was fantastic. Thanks very much to James and Jonathan. Extremely interesting conversation. And look, we can only answer so much in a short time, but hopefully that flagged up some important issues and work that's being done. And next on the bill this morning, before our networking break, is Neil Walker, the technical director at Atkins. He'll be talking about reframing transformational asset management. So start sending in your questions now so that we can answer them live on air once Neil's spoken. Following this short video, he'll be on with you in 60 seconds time.